Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Telling the truth is a bad idea.
None of it makes sense. None of it.
Where they're using false diagnoses.
You sure you want to do this?
And then misrepresented sexes in order to bill insurance companies to conceal, quote unquote, gender affirming care.
You know what history does to trained physicians who ignore science.
Oh, wow. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder at 8 and prescribed Prozac.
What if you had to tell someone the most important thing in the world, but you knew they'd never believe you?
Their families left in ruins.
Bleeding with pain and soaking with pain.
Telling the truth can be dangerous business. Why? Why?
In June 2024, California Shasta County CPS seized our 15-year-old virgin daughter, not for abuse or neglect, but solely because we refused to affirm her sudden desire to transition.
Because that's what families do. Mom, they take care of each other.
What I mean by that is back in the 70s, lesbian mothers were in a position to lose their children just because they were lesbian.
Oh, is that brilliant? Telling the truth can be dangerous business. Honest and popular don't go hand in hand.
How much money we think each patient would bring in, and this is only including top surgery. This doesn't include any bottom surgery, and it's a lot of money. These surgeries make a lot of money. So females and male chest reconstruction can bring in $40,000.
And so my story is different from a lot of the others, the younger generation now, because I didn't do it because I wanted to be a man. I never medicalized except for testosterone, and the testosterone, the long-term usage of testosterone, was what caused me to have a hysterectomy and was a major contributor to those 5 heart attacks that you mentioned.
Tell the truth.
When it settles onto the ground, when we have to actually make decisions about our own safety, or as a clinician, if I'm doing risk assessment and talking to people about institutional placement decisions, sex is a part of that picture. It has to be. And I don't think there are very many trans men who don't understand that.
Tell him the truth! You lied and cheated?
I was depressed, and I had also learned that I like girls and started identifying as LGBTQ in general. So that's what led me to online.
Dangerous! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
And then she goes on to say in her article, if this critical misunderstanding, which creates years of disability, medical, shopping, hopelessness, and failed interventions, is unfortunate, its extension into gender medicine is tragic.
You never know what someone might believe.
Telling the truth is a difficult problem. Telling the truth is a scary. Telling the truth is a scary predicament. Telling the truth is a bitter herb. Forget herb. I never heard of a hit that had the word herb in it. Telling the truth is.
Welcome, y'all. If this is your first time here, we're so glad that you are. If it's not your first time, well, welcome back. And if you're watching this recorded on YouTube, we are delighted that you are watching it there. Or maybe you're just watching it again because you missed something. All of that is wonderful, and I appreciate it. My name is Ellen Jimerson, and this podcast is called Moving Parts, Why Children Become Trans. At least I think that's the name. I think that's the name of it. And before we get into the gender news, I was remiss last week and not mentioning that Darla, who is always in the booth, who pushes all the buttons and keep things going smoothly, had agreed to do the segment on John Money, and she did an absolutely stellar job. Her research was perfect. The graphs, the fonts, the movement of the storytelling, all of that was just wonderful. And John Money is somebody you need to know about if you want to sort of get caught up on how we got where we are today with gender. And I also want to mention that Darla has published the first of a series of books, and that's probably backwards in it, but that's the cover as I can show it. It's a series of books she started, and it's the Ruby and Fig series, and it's just a delightful book. I bought one copy and I'll buy more. It details the lives of her dogs, Ruby and Fig, on the lake that she and her partner live on. And it's just the kind of book you really want to get back into kids' hands. They really don't need to be reading, in my opinion, some of these heavier and, in my opinion, too many of them are inappropriate for little kids. This is just what you want. It's about how we become friends with each other. It's about discovering the world around us, discovering turtles and all those kinds of things. And it's just a lovely little book. I hope you will look her up and buy the book and give it to some little kid who will really enjoy it, and the parents will enjoy reading it too. So now we come to happenings in the world of gender this week, and of course the Sophie Cunningham story continues. She being one of the Women's National Basketball Association players who made the comment that she didn't think that men who approach as women, who present themselves as women, either through surgeries and hormones or through identity, need to be playing in the Women's National Basketball Association. And the commissioner of the WNBA, whose last name is Engelbert, wrote that the league will always approach this topic thoughtfully, respectfully, and in alignment with the long-standing values of our league. Second, our player eligibility rules, unlike the eligibility rules of some other leagues and governing bodies, are collectively bargained. Lastly, preserving the integrity of our game and ensuring fair competition will always remain among the league's highest priority. The league's collective bargaining agreement states that only players who are women are eligible to play in the WNBA, but it does not include any specific language about gender identity or sex assigned at birth. On Friday, two former NBA players, Enes Kanter Freedom and Royce White, declared themselves eligible for the WNBA draft, saying they identify as women. We recognize this as a complex and nuanced topic, and we will continue to have important conversations with all of you and the Players Association in the weeks and months ahead, Engelbert said in the memo. We also plan to convene additional discussions and offer listening sessions for any team leaders who would like to participate. Your perspectives and feedback are invaluable, and I appreciate those who have already reached out to share their thoughts. I do want to say that the announcement by Freedom and White that they intended to put themselves up for membership or inclusion in the WNBA caused quite a stir on my Facebook page. And I really didn't see it coming. There were, and it's all good. That's why I post on Facebook. It's all good. People objected that anyone would see their volunteering or trying to be on the team as being something to be rejected rather than embraced. At least one person expressed dismay over their character vis-a-vis women in general. And as I say, I was sort of taken aback because my point in posting it was that this could force the issue as to whether men belong in women's sports in the wider context. But a lot of people didn't really see it that way, and they felt that it was a slam to the efforts of feminists to sort of control their own spaces. However, and honestly, when I posted it, I hadn't realized that the WNBA has a policy restricting players to women only, and that there already has been a trans woman in the WNBA whose name is Lashaya, I think. I should have written it down, but I didn't. The issue there, though, being the fact that she was born female, she has had a double mastectomy, but she's never had any testosterone. And she is, basically a female who has had her breasts amputated. So that is not the same thing as admitting men to teams. Anyway, that's that has been quite an item among people who follow the trans issue. Second, President Donald Trump's administration said that Medicaid would stop paying for gender-affirming surgeries and hormone treatments for transgender minors, and the state Children's Health Insurance Program won't pay for the treatments for those under 19. The announcement is the latest in a series of policies from the administration, and the text that I read then goes on to say aimed at transgender people, which is another instance of the journalism being inaccurate. These policies have been aimed at minors. The policy is to take effect October 13th. It is not clear how much taxpayer funding is going to cover gender-affirming treatments for transgender youth now. And there again, they make a statement that the youth are transgender and without any other qualifications. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services did not respond to questions about the policy on Tuesday. At least 27 states have already banned gender-affirming care for those under 18. Even in states that haven't, many major hospitals have stopped providing some of the treatments, and gender-affirming surgeries for minors are rare. I think many of us would dispute that. Of course, you'd have to define rare. Puberty blockers and hormone treatments are more common. That may be true. The policy calls for Medicaid and CHIP to continue to pay for mental health treatment for transgender minors, but phase out coverage of hormone treatments that are used both to block puberty and to produce sex-related physical changes for those already receiving them as of April 2027. And so that's it for transgender news. And so we can just boldly march into today's topic. And the way it came about was, let me back it up a little bit and say this is something we have, the format, the way we do it is not something we've done in the past. And so bear with me. I probably will be reading a lot just because that's the best way to do it, I think. But earlier in the week, Stella O'Malley, whose picture I have there, Darla, if you can find it. There's Stella. Isn't she cute? She's so pretty. She's Irish. She is one of my favorites in the gender podcasting world. She has just earned her doctorate, and she's a psychotherapist and has taken a great interest in the issue of trans kids and their families and trans people in general. But she is very steady, very even, and very knowledgeable. She had on her show a man whose name is Emmet Connor. And there's Emmet. I really can't figure out who Emmet is, other than he seems to have been a comic and a comedian, and he has some books out, but I couldn't really find much information on what his qualifications might be, where he gets his ideas from. At any rate, he proposed, and I do want to stop and say Stella is absolutely right that we've got to move beyond talking about doctors and nurses and hospitals and hormones and surgeries if we're going to understand why things are the way they are now. As a historian, I know that full well. There's never just one causal factor, one causation. It's usually much more complicated, particularly when you've got an issue like this, with a lot of, as I call the podcast, a lot of moving parts. So she's absolutely on track with that. Emmet Connor has a book out called Red Pandemic, The Global Marxist Cult. And in it, he makes the claim that transgenderism can be traced to Marxism. And I didn't disagree with everything he had to say, but I disagreed with so much of it. I absolutely was not persuaded that transgenderism can be traced to Marxism. And a couple of isms came up in the interview. And I really think it's important that we have some definitions on the table so we know what we're talking about. So an ism, I thought we would get into some of these terms, what they mean. An ism is a doctrine or a belief system. For example, racism is the belief system that white people are superior to Black people for various reasons, or vice versa. Sexism, which is the idea that it's an idea that women are inferior to men when it comes to intellectual and political issues. Patriotism, it's the belief that you should love your country. Marxism, by the same token, is an ism. It's something you think. It's the way you think. Marxism is an analytical framework that places class struggle at the center of historical developments. So Marx, by the way, Marx was not a Russian. He was not a Soviet. He was a Prussian. We would call him now a German. I've actually got a picture of Marx too, Darla, if you want to look for it. At least I think I do. It places class struggle at the center of historical developments. You can't talk about Marxism without talking about classes. Connor objects he believes that Marxism is all about people feeling oppressed. It doesn't really, he really, if he thinks otherwise, he didn't say it, and I didn't pick up on it. Marxism is a framework in which you center the working class. And as part of that, Marxism talks about capitalism. And I don't believe I ever heard Connor mention capitalism, which is a very strange thing given that he wants to talk about Marxism, because I think you can easily trace the transgender, particularly the transgender child phenomenon, to capitalism. And we see that in the little short I put together called Tell the Truth, where we hear the doctor at Vanderbilt talking about how much money can be made on what she euphemistically calls top surgery alone, or mastectomies. So he never talks about capitalism. And in capitalism, and of course, the book for which Marx was most well known was called Das Kapital, or Capital. That's at the heart of Marxism. Capitalism, in capitalism, there is a ruling class which owns the means of production. It exploits the working class, who must then sell whatever power they have, which is their labor, in order to survive. So it sets up the terms that Marx used and some people still use, which are not always very helpful because we don't think in these terms. But it sets up the merchants, the planters, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, or the working classes too. I mean, they could be working classes, they can be peasants, those kinds of things. He never mentions capitalism, which is, I mean, I don't know how you can talk about Marxism without talking about capitalism, and without really getting into the issue of classes. Globalism, which also comes up in he equates Marxism with globalism. Globalism, again, is an ism. It has to do with the interconnectedness of social systems across the globe and how we think about all of that. And because capitalism is dependent on owning the means of production, i.e. private property, according to Marx, and to people who follow Marx, not necessarily verbatim, but have that general understanding of capitalism, class struggle, and so forth, private property must give way to communalism or socialism via some kind of revolution. And I didn't put this in I intended to put in a definition for revolution, but revolution doesn't necessarily mean armed conflict. It can mean, just turning the revolutions of a wheel or something like that, or revolutions in thinking, that kind of thing. So, but it means there will be some sort of specific conflict with a beneficiary and those who don't benefit. Oh, by the way, I meant to mention, and I didn't. Why do I think I'm qualified to talk about this? Well, for one thing, I do have a PhD in history. My PhD was focused on intellectual and cultural history in the 20th century. I went on after that to go to Vanderbilt Divinity School to study liberation theology as it emanates from Latin America. So I have an MTS, a Master's in Theological Studies also. And so liberation theology it is often said that the liberation theologians were influenced by Marx. I think it's probably more accurate to say that that is true, but what really influenced them was a very close reading of the Bible, of the anti-Caesar, anti-Pharaoh, anti-kings position of the writers of the Bible, and by looking around them at the poverty that had been impressed on Latin Americans by capitalist, imperialist, and U.S. domination. So that is what makes me think I'm qualified to speak to Emmet Connor's ideas. In addition, I've spent the last 20 years of my life looking into these issues, and so Connor's got a huge problem with what he calls open borders, which don't exist, and I'll get into that in a moment, and immigration. And this is something I've noticed with just a handful, but a big enough handful of anti-medicalization activists who have this strong anti-immigrant stance. And Emmet Connor is very, very explicit about that. So that interests me too, because I think he's making claims that just won't stand up. I said that. A conspiracy, this also came up. A conspiracy is a plan or an agreement between people for an unlawful or harmful purpose, e.g. corruption, especially with a political motivation. In a political sense, conspiracy refers to a group of people united in the goal of subverting established political power structures. People do not need to conspire to engage. People would not need to conspire if what they wanted to engage with were lawful, ethical, and were not plans that great numbers of people would challenge. And so what's an open border? An open border is a border allowing for the free movement of people among jurisdictions and states with no border control. Now, I really want y'all, if you haven't yet, or even if you have, watch it again. I made a documentary which took a good portion of my life. It took 5 years to make. A good chunk of my money, my energy and so forth. It's called The Second Cooler. It's a documentary narrated by Martin Sheen, and you can watch it for free on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@EllenJemerson. And I lay all this out in some detail. So what I want to do is not necessarily talk about all the things that Emmet Connor said or didn't say, but just to sort of switch, because everything he says to me, not everything, much of what he says to me is not defined. It's not backed up with statistics or, any knowledge at all. And I would like to get into that. And so I will enter it through the way I best know how to enter that, which is to offer up the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, as a case study. And many of these talking points can be understood. We can understand that what Connor has to say is inaccurate. Not necessarily in terms of Marxism, but in terms of his ideas about people having a sense of being oppressed, his talk about open borders, his talk about immigration, his absence of talking about capitalism, and you can even get into conspiracy. And if I remember to do all the things I intend to do, I will talk about that. So the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was a globalization, or it gets us in the direction of globalization. It was an agreement among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And what it wanted to do was to open up markets, and to do that, to remove barriers like tariffs. Tariffs are taxes which protect local businesses, local farmers, and those, local small producers. So what CAFTA, it's very clear that it was, it's an agreement among three powerful political governmental entities: Canada, the US, and Mexico. The Prime Minister of Canada who signed it was Brian Mulroney. It was signed in the US by Bill Clinton, and in Mexico by Carlos Salinas. So there's a big difference between what the people who drew up the NAFTA agreement wanted and what they said they wanted. What they said they wanted was to lift Mexicans out of poverty. What they said they wanted was a more level playing field. And they made a somewhat deliberate attempt to confuse free markets with fair markets. They were very successful in doing that. So what did NAFTA entail? First of all, prior to NAFTA, there were some policies and some programs prior to NAFTA that set the stage for NAFTA, one of which, the constructing of the Maquiladora zone across northern Mexico. This began in the 1960s, so there was a long run up to NAFTA. And the Maquiladoras, a maquiladora is just a factory. These were factories that were absorbing displaced Mexicans. They were notoriously bad places in which to work. In my movie, I have an interview with a young woman whose name is Polita, and she had been, Al, excuse me, Al, I'm live now, Al, as I always am at this time. All right, bye. Husbands, come on now. All right, where was I? The maquiladoras. So Polita spoke of being pregnant in a maquiladora in Nogales, Sonora being the northern state of Arizona, and it's just across the border from Nogales, Arizona. She spoke of being pregnant and not being allowed any sort of bathroom break, for example. So it's unkind, it's humiliating to work in these maquiladoras. And the last time I went there to Nogales, which was about 6 years ago, other groups of people were being displaced, and the people in the shelters were saying they likely would never make it to the States, but they would be absorbed into the maquilas. And one of the people I interviewed for the Second Cooler said, and this, I interviewed him in 2008, so almost 20 years ago. And he said he went down, this was after NAFTA was signed and began to be implemented. He would go down to the maquilas and train people to work in them. And he said the people he was training were making $5 a day. And not even in Mexico can you exist on $5 a day. So that was one of the run-ups. But one of the key, so Marx talks about capital. He talks about private property. He talks about the struggles between the classes. So with NAFTA and any of the free trade agreements, what you get is a system in which capital can cross borders freely. Product, like the automobiles and TVs made in the maquilas, they can cross borders freely, but the people displaced by NAFTA and later on CAFTA and the other agreements cannot cross borders freely. One of the conditions for Mexico being able to enter into the the NAFTA free trade agreement was to repeal Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution. Article 27 was a constitutional victory won back as part of the Mexican Revolution. I believe I'm correct in saying that, back in the early 1900s. And what it did was grant indigenous peoples the ability to stay on their traditional lands, and they lived there communally. They did not have title to private parcels of land. It was owned communally. This was part of the Constitution. It was what was keeping peasants in Chiapas and Oaxaca on their lands legally. They were not making a killing by any means, but with Article 24 and with tariffs, they were able to stay on their lands, their communally held traditional ancestral lands. It had to be removed. That is not a blow at communal property. That is a bid for private property, for turning communal property into private property, displacing people from it, opening those lands up to the markets, and with the removal of tariffs, making those peasants unable to compete with the major producers of corn and beans like Archer Daniels Midland, which continued to receive subsidies. I hope I'm making sense. If you've got any comments or questions, just shout out and I'll do my best to answer them. So we can't talk about Marxism without talking about the abolition of private property. But what happened with NAFTA, which is and free trade agreements generally, and which is an aspect of globalization, we have a quest for more and more private property on steroids. Nobody's trying to abolish private property. The corporations are trying to get their hands on other people's property. They want other people's property because they want whatever it is they can do on that property. They also want access to the aquifers, the water resources which are underneath those lands. They want to be able to sell their cheap corn and beans to other Mexicans. And so that is getting your hands on somebody else's private property. And that's not Marxism. On the day that NAFTA was signed, there was an uprising, by a group known as the Zapatistas, who took over the courthouse in somewhere in Chiapas, I want to say. The leader was Comandante Marcos, and were they rebelling against NAFTA because they wanted to destroy private property? Well, what they wanted was to be able to maintain their communal property. And so, just a basic understanding of what was happening. I have witnessed protests in Mexico City. To say that there's this conspiracy to do away with private property, and you somehow connect that to open borders it's an argument without a logic. And so what else happened in conjunction with NAFTA? In conjunction with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, borders were not opened. Far from it. The borders began to be hardened. And if you go to the border now, you will see people talk about Trump's wall. That's nonsense. It was Bill Clinton's, the Bush's, Obama's, Biden's wall. The border started to be militarized. And the purpose of militarizing the border was to keep displaced peoples from coming across the border and trying to get access to the means of life that had been taken from them. So you go there, and there are walls made of leftover metal panels from the Gulf War. There are infrared cameras everywhere. There are all sorts of surveillance systems, which just gets harder and harder and harder. Police dogs, Border Patrol vehicles everywhere. There have been so many people displaced and so many people trying to cross the border that Bill Clinton authorized a policy that is still a federal policy in the U.S., which is known as prevention through deterrence. The prevention was to stop migrants from trying to cross basically through the urban areas, which are the safest areas in which to cross, and to funnel them at the time into the Sonoran Desert, which is quite inhospitable. The idea was that migrants would get out into the desert. A limited number would die of exposure or through other means. Word would get back to their sending communities, and they would stop trying to come. That, of course, was a failure. They didn't stop trying to come. And this has cost having to cross a militarized border. And I didn't mention that they don't have access to coming legally because they have to have title to land, and they have to have a certain amount of money in the bank to ensure that they'll go home again. So thinking back to the indigenous who were holding their lands on their lands communally, they don't have title to land. They can't produce it's not possible. And of course, all of these restrictions are in there for a reason. So again, my point is, I don't think Connor has really thought very deeply about all of this, nor does he seem to have much of a knowledge foundation to make his claims. There are no open borders. So one of the consequences has been thousands of migrants, including infants, little girls, little boys, pregnant women, grandparents who have died trying to cross the border, trying to get across. I've talked to a number of them, not obviously not the ones who died, but I've talked to people who did lose loved ones trying to cross, and I can assure you that, and I can assure Emmet Connor that people would come legally if they could. There is no open border. We can nail that down. There is no open border. Quite the opposite. The borders have hardened. One of the books I want to direct you to is any book written by Todd Miller. Todd is a journalist who focuses on the border. He has a wonderful podcast. He's written a number of books. No, that's Emmet. That's Todd. Todd is a personal friend. He and I had talked at one point about doing another documentary about the expansion of the borders and building on his book called Empire of Borders, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world. And in the book, it is just a brilliant book. I have read it maybe 4 times, and I've got it all underlined and all of that. He is very clear. Not only are the borders hardening, but the U.S. border is expanding. He makes the statement, or maybe he's quoting someone, where he says, the U.S.-Mexico border doesn't begin in Nogales or San Diego. It begins in Peru, which is an odd statement to make until you try to see what he means. And what he means is that there is a U.S. Border Patrol presence in Peru, in Haiti, in countries in Africa, in the Middle East. This is not an ideological presence. This is not an ism that's present. This is the United States Border Patrol actively present, actively controlling people's borders, actively interfering with the abilities of people to move. So what we actually have is a hardened border with U.S. military, Homeland Security, in all sorts of places that he talks about in the world. Let me see if I can. He talks about the Palestine-Mexico border, the Philippines, the Caribbean frontier, the periphery of our empire, the global caste system, by which he means that what has happened is we're not looking at the abolition of private property. We are not looking at recognition of a class struggle in order to shore up the well-being of working class peoples or peasants. Exactly the opposite is what is factually happening. Let's see, the right to the world on the U.S.-Syria border, the U.S.-African border. And so what he argues for is that we return to the time when we had no concept of these fixed borders and like that. And he tells a story that has stuck with me. He tells a story of a gay man from Florida, I think he was, who had gone to Canada and was wanting to come back into the United States, which is his home. And the Border Patrol officer there, took took his cell phone from him. And keep in mind, the only thing you need to cross, an American needs to cross the border with Canada, I think it may have changed a little bit now, but then was a passport. That's or nothing. You didn't even really need a passport. You just could come on through. But he requisitioned his cell phone, and in it were addresses or something like that, websites having to do with gay men having sex. And the Border Patrol agent said he wouldn't let him through. He kept him there for, I forget how long, but it was enough to scare the living daylights out of this man in Florida. And the Border Patrol officer said to him, "We don't need people like you. We're perverts," something like that, in the States. And so he arrested him, basically, stopped him. And I can tell you from experience, having been arrested by Border Patrol in Asia, that it is the most frightening thing that can happen to you. They have total power over you. They can say anything they want to you. They can demand anything from you that they want to demand. And it is absolutely terrifying. The man was able to go on his way, and, that's good. But that is not an open border. There's nothing about this that speaks to open borders. There is no argument that we now have an open border system, and that and something to do with mass migration. Again, I want to emphasize that if people could stay on their own lands, for one thing, that would be helpful. If they weren't being displaced by our policies, that would be helpful. Let's talk some about the conspiracy aspect. Stella points out that by conspiracy, it doesn't mean that you've got a group of people sitting around a table scheming and working up a plan. I think you can, without qualification or hesitation, call Barack Obama's approach to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was another proposed free trade agreement involving the Pacific Rim companies. He wanted to negotiate it. He wanted to fast track it. Now, fast track sounds like it means removing complications. What it meant was that he was negotiating it in secret. Why would you negotiate a free trade agreement in secret if the agreement was going to be the rising tide that lifts all boats? There would be no need for it. It would just, and I mean, people who watch these things referred to the Trans-Pacific Partnership as NAFTA on steroids. And you can also talk about Hillary Clinton and her effort to overthrow the legally elected president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, who was engaging in actual socialist-leaning activities. He was working to keep the lands of indigenous people in their hands, and so forth and so on. Hillary Clinton, built a private server for one reason and one reason only. You're conducting official government business in secret. You don't want other people to know. Why don't you want other people to know? Because it goes against the interest of a lot of people, Hondurans, but other people too. And mostly, who did it benefit? Dole Foods, for one thing, on whose payroll Hillary Clinton was. That was the time when she was Secretary of State for Barack Obama. So if you want to talk about conspiracies, it's not difficult to get into the idea of these conspiracies going on, but they're not about promoting Marxism, socialism, the abolition of private property, controlling capitalism, controlling imperialism. That's not what's going on. And if you don't look at anything else, again, I urge you, get this book, read it. It's easy to read. It's very well researched. It's very well received by other journalists who cover the border or borders. And so that is, let's see, how long have we been going? An hour. Let me just, there was something else I wanted to, so I've got some other books. There's this little series called A Very Short Introduction to, and they're like, I don't know, 100 titles or something, but these are short. I've got one on capitalism, written by James Fulcher. Yeah, there we go. I've got one on Marx, written by Peter Singer. There we go. One written on globalization by Manfred B. Steger. And so, so again, to try to come back to Emmet Connor, his what he says, but which he can't support and doesn't really attempt to, is that globalization is a Marxist project. I hope I've said enough to at least make you look at the absurdity of that statement. And so one of the things, let's see, I meant to put a marker in here and I did not. So in this little book, if I can find it, he talks about the myths of globalization, and they will all sound very reasonable to you. And another word for another way of looking at globalization is to call it neoliberalism. Shoot, why didn't I put my marker in here? Because this is helpful. Dog, take it, Ellen. You know, you have one job. One job. Oh, well, let me see if I can just tell you. He's one of the things he says. Oh, wait. Okay. Anyway, he says there are a number of myths surrounding globalization. And back to this idea of conspiracy or whatever, the idea is that free markets, we have a comment. Oh, yeah. Sorry, let me get back to where I was. Is the idea that all of these things that are going on, globalization, is driven by markets, that there's nobody at the helm, that globalized markets, a caste system involving people who can cross borders freely and people who must not. All of these things, there's been a promotion of the idea that all of this is inevitable and irreversible. It is, man, I can't believe I didn't mark this because he says it so much better than I. So I can put it in the show notes. Y'all, that makes me so mad. Mad at myself. And thank you for hanging in there with me. If you here we go. Okay, I thought this was important. He writes that Business Week, The Economist, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times are among the most powerful of dozens of magazines, journals, newspapers, and electronic media published in the wealthy countries of the Northern Hemisphere that feed their readers a steady diet of globalist claims. Globalism has become what some social and political thinkers call a quote, strong discourse, end quote, one that is notoriously difficult to resist and repel because it has on its side powerful social forces that have already pre-selected what counts as real and therefore shape the world accordingly. The constant repetition and public recitation of globalism's central claims and slogans have the capacity to produce what they name. As more neoliberal policies are enacted, the claims of globalism become even more firmly planted in the public mind. And so this is the first claim he mentions, and I won't go into it, but just, if you're interested, you can get this little book. It couldn't be very expensive. Globalization, this is the claim. Globalization is about the liberalization and global integration of markets. It's anchored in the idea that the self-regulating market, that the market is self-regulating. The second is that globalization is inevitable and irreversible, which is what I have said. And he says, throughout the 20th century, liberals and conservatives have leveled reasonable criticisms against Marxists for their determinist claims that devalue human free agency. But that is what this claim is a determinist claim. It's already been set in motion. There's nothing we can do to stop it. And it's ultimately for the greater good of all mankind. And if you look at poverty statistics and immigration, all of that, you're going to find something else. The third claim is that nobody is in charge of globalization. Again, you've got this deterministic language that says people aren't in charge of it. Just markets and just technology. The market is the thing, and it operates beyond, it's almost like the deist theory of God as the clockmaker who wound up the clock and then it just ticks away, and he's gone. The fourth claim is that globalization benefits everyone, and you've heard that. You've heard it over and over and over. You've heard it. Let's see. They talk about rising global living standards, economic efficiency, and all of that we heard with NAFTA. All of that we heard with CAFTA. All of that we've heard with every sort of effort to consolidate the power and the bank accounts of a handful of people at the expense of millions and millions of other people. Let's see. I think there was one more. Don't you love being read to? It's my favorite thing. But the fifth claim, globalization furthers the spread of democracy in the world. This is it. How? How can it possibly spread democracy in the world? And that claim is going unchallenged in the public discourse. So here are a couple of quotes from people you may have heard of. This is from Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board. There can be little doubt that the extraordinary changes in global finance on balance have been beneficial in facilitating significant improvements in economic structures and living standards throughout the world. Peter Sutherland, who was chairman of British Petroleum, said globalization's effects have been overwhelmingly good. Ask those people displaced in Chiapas how much better their lives are. Ask Hondurans how much better their lives are. Spurred by unprecedented liberalization, world trade continues to expand faster than overall global economic output, inducing a wave of productivity and efficiency and creating millions of jobs. And then finally, George David, who was CEO of United Technologies Corporation, wrote, "We are at an optimistic time in our world. The barriers between nations are down. Economic liberalism is decidedly afoot and proven to be sound. Trade and investment are soaring. Income disparities between nations are narrowing, and wealth generation is at record high levels, and I believe likely to remain so." Really? See, this to me sounds closer to what Emmet Connor has to say, which bears no relationship to Marxism, and how he gets from transgender hormone surgeries, puberty blockers on children to Marxism. I mean, how many impossible things can you believe before breakfast? All of this is, and I really want to nail home the point that there are no open borders. There are no open borders, people. But as Peter Steger in his book on globalization says, if you get people reciting a creed often enough, they will so internalize it that they cannot repel it. I'm a Baptist, despite my membership now in a Presbyterian church. But Baptists are non-creedal people, and there's a reason for that. And so even though when it comes time to say the Apostles' Creed, I say it, I don't stand up and refuse to say it, but you say it enough. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he arose again from the dead, and he sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. He will come to judge the quick and the dead. I believe this. I believe it. I must believe it. My eternal salvation depends on it. You say that so often, and when somebody like me comes along and says, I think you're missing the point. I don't think you have to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin in order to understand the gist of the Bible, which is the gist of the Bible and what it all hangs on is God and Caesar are not the same. The kingdom of heaven on earth and the national security state are not the same. They are not. They don't intersect. They never will. And of course, that is a dangerous way to think if you really believe, and dangerous to hear it, if you really believe that capitalism is God's economy, imperialism is God's economy, that if you hear it enough, that trans children are another type of lesbian girls, gay boys, non-conforming children. And what we need to do in order to support them is mutilate their bodies, and all of those things. To me, if you want to, I think Stella O'Malley is absolutely right. We need to think about the multiple causal reasons behind what's going on with the medicalization of children, taking their lives from them, deforming their bodies, all of those things. We need to look at, I don't think it's helpful to look at Marxism. I think we can take that off the table. I think we should look at try to figure out how we got here, and understanding figures like John Money is a good way to go. Listening to people's stories, as we do on this podcast, to try to figure out how they got where they got. And it doesn't always have to do with, as Aaron Kimberly and Jesse Harris and Xander, and I guess others too have said, it didn't have anything to do with thinking they were men trapped in women's bodies. It had to do with homophobia. It had to do with a host of other things. But I think we also need to look at journalism, like the text that I was reading you, where it says, where people keep saying medical care is being withheld from transgender children, which is just not true. Look it up. Look it up. So anyway, we have gone a full hour. Let me know if you liked this sort of format of me just jabbering on about things I actually know something about, or what you think. And I always forget to say, but I always mean to say, please like this video, please offer a comment, please share it, and please subscribe. It's really important. If we actually care about these kids and about what people are going through, it helps, the algorithm, the all-knowing algorithm in this world we're now living in needs for you to do that. Okay. I think Darla's going to roll us out. Thank you. And I hope you have a good rest of the week, and I will see you back here next Tuesday. All right.